I'm Glyph. I think about software and computers a lot, possibly too much. Today, I'm going to think some of those thoughts out loud at you. Some of you may have heard me speak before. In my speaking experience, when I've selected a topic, it's usually something quite specific, usually technical, but keynotes are a little bit different. So for a keynote, I'm not here to educate, but to inspire. In the words of Wiktionary, where desperate keynote speakers go to find out what they're actually supposed to be doing, to set the main theme. And when I asked the organizing committee about constraints, to quote from an email that Jesse sent me, which he may come to bitterly regret, any topic is fair game. So I did put some hints about the theme into the title, but the title's a little bit of a mouthful. So before we get into the meat of it, let me break it down for you. The Automatic Computer and You, a meditation upon the history and future of software development. All of these words are important. I'm going to talk about the consequences of computers being as they are automatic. I'm going to definitely say a thing or two about computers. I'm going to talk about you. All of us have a role to play in this community, and all of us still have a surprising degree of influence over the history of that community as it develops. This will be a meditation in the slightly more obscure sense of a contemplative discourse, often on a religious or philosophical subject. And computers are both religious and philosophical, as anyone who has tried to debug something for more than 2 hours at a time will tell you. I'm also going to talk about the process of developing software, its development and not just its existence, especially once you connect it to a network, as almost all software is now. It's a living thing that needs to transform and develop to survive. But the two terms that I think are most important here are those that remain: history and future. I'm going to talk about history, and I think that we as a community do not necessarily learn enough from history, and about the future, which is novelty obsessed as we software folks can sometimes be. We don't necessarily think about it in long-term enough terms. If that sounds like a lot to get through in 40 minutes, especially with the projector issues, you're not wrong. So as much as I'd like to and I'm going to ramble on here, I do need to bring some focus to this topic. So as any keynote speaker must, I will use my own understanding and experiences as a lens through which we might all see software. So what unique perspective can I bring to you all? I'm a middle-aged, middle-class, pudgy white guy who gained some notoriety with an early career success. So there's a feeling, a life stage that I am poised to experience, which I feel like the entire software development community as a whole might be experiencing along with me. And I might even have a broader perspective on that can help. What I'm referring to, of course, is the venerable midlife crisis. Since I don't want to assume everybody has the same cultural context, a midlife crisis is a psychological phenomenon, more widely circulated in comedy than in actual psychology, when a middle-aged person suddenly has a crisis of identity. In a period of transition between youth, the period of life where we're all learning and preparing with most of our lives ahead of us, full of infinite possibilities, where we might be capable of anything, and we just can't wait to find out what that is. And middle age, the period where, having chosen a goal, we have to work really hard at it for a really long time. And it turns out that each of us has only about one person's worth of energy and enthusiasm and ability and drive to have an impact on the world. Some people experience a crisis of identity at this time. They may begin to despair, asking themselves questions like, is this all there is? Will I ever feel young again? What about my dreams? Before I go any further, I should say to any family or friends or coworkers who might be watching this, don't worry about me. I'm not experiencing any acute psychological stressors. My life is honestly pretty great. In fact, when one digs in a little more deeply on the pop cultural phenomenon of the midlife crisis and the psychology behind that phenomenon, it turns out that absent any significant trauma, midlife is actually a pretty great time for most people. The idea of a midlife crisis as a universal experience is a little bit of a boogeyman. Everyone asks these questions in midlife, and everyone's a little bit anxious about the answers and what they might be. But it's not really a crisis unless asking those questions leads you into a deep depression. Similarly, the stereotypical blunders one makes during a midlife crisis, wrecking one's relationship to seek out a younger romantic partner, or buying and then wrecking an expensive sports car in a desperate effort to feel young again, while they're troubling signs for some people, are actually pretty uncommon. So when I say the software industry and community is going through this with me, I of course don't mean that everyone in it is middle-aged. What I mean is to say that the industry as a whole has matured to the point where we're starting to have a big impact, and we're also starting to see the limitations of its potential. But that means we're all starting to collectively ask some stressful but important questions. Signs that this is happening are everywhere. Just a few days before I was scheduled to deliver this talk, the venerable MC Frontalot released a new album, Net Split, or The Fathomless Heartbreak of Online Itself. As the kids say, big mood. An album whose title gives you a pretty good idea of what you're in for. It's full of songs longing for an earlier, simpler time on the internet, while at the same time gradually realizing that maybe it was pretty terrible all the time, and some of us just weren't seeing all the problems. So everyone's a little afraid of middle age. You start seeing the first few signs of aging. You don't have quite the energy you used to. But as I said before, for individuals, psychological research shows this is actually a great time for most people, where they're coming into their own, they're really maximizing the impact of their skills, and it can be the same for us as an industry. Plus, I don't think there's anything to worry about, right? It's not like prominent people from the software industry are buying and wrecking sports cars and ridiculous stunts. So, let's say you all agree with me, and software development is in its midlife, and we may or may not be having a crisis. So what should we do about it? Where should we go looking for the answers to these uncomfortable questions, and how do we even figure out which ones are the right ones to ask? Looking at both successful and unsuccessful stories of midlife, there are common themes that one can see in popular culture, in philosophy and in history. The first thing that one can do is turn inwards, to ask questions that are about me, me, me. This is where your stereotypical sitcom responses to midlife come from. How do I recapture the feeling of being young? What am I going to do to make myself happy today? Why is this making me feel bad today? In other words, to zoom in. But the essence of a successful midlife is not to try to simulate the time that's passed, but rather to apply the wisdom that one has spent one's youth to acquire to expand the scope of those questions. In other words, to zoom out. Every good talk has a call to action, and I'm going to be very explicit about this. That's what I'm asking all of you to do. I'm asking you to zoom out. Personally, I'm excited for the opportunity for reflection that this collective midlife affords us. Our industry has historically been plagued by a myopic view, too much near-term thinking. Every technology older than a couple of years is legacy. Every field that isn't software-powered needs to be disrupted. If we look at the bigger picture, though, we may start to discover more interesting and less stereotypical ways to apply software, and maybe some places that we just shouldn't. So for example, here are some bad questions we could be asking ourselves as software developers. How do we disrupt more industries? How do we get better at optimizing time on site? How can we become more innovative? In other words, we shouldn't try to ask how to go back to the early days of the field where everything that was happening was world-changing, where everything was going to affect everybody in the world. Because that's not what's happening now. We have more mature tools, we have a better understanding of the impact that we have. A lot of the broad categories like platforms and operating systems are already established. And sometimes applying technology to a new field is not positive. Instead, we should be asking questions like, how does software development fit into the broader pattern of history? And what might we learn from other fields? Instead of trying to disrupt them, what can we learn from them? As we look to our history, we should not be asking, how do we get back to that place? But rather, what were those early pioneers trying to do? And to the extent that we still believe in that vision, how can we carry it forward into a new era? We could also look more broadly over society. How does software impact society? How can we better understand its secondary and tertiary effects? At this point, I feel compelled to refer you to a talk that inspired some of these thoughts from the inimitable James Mikans. And if you thought my talk's title was a bit of a mouthful, wait till you hear his. Question, why do keynote speakers keep suggesting that improving security is possible? Answer, because keynote speakers make bad life decisions and are poor role models. True fact. But the idea that this talk is borrowing from here is the one of technological manifest destiny that he talks about in his talk, which is that technology is always a good thing, and adding more technology to something always makes it better. So while I think it's important to contemplate how we can make things better with software, it's important to contemplate the negative ones to ensure that we can avoid them. So with that fairly expansive preamble out of the way, I'd like to share my own suggestions as to how we might zoom out. The first is zooming out in time, looking further into our collective past than we normally would. So I'd like to share my own perspective on the history of computers. Perhaps the first and most important question about the history of software on automatic computers is, what the heck are computers good for anyway? I think it's fairly clear from history that the answer is actually quite simple, and it's only one thing: video games. Now, you may have used an automatic computer at one time, And you might well have done something with one of those devices you would not classify as a video game. I'll get to the classification of what is and isn't a video game in a little bit, but first I'd like to illustrate how the history of computers is, in fact, a history of video games. And certainly this lends itself to the theme. What better way to mark a midlife crisis today than to wax nostalgic about old video games? My own path that led me to becoming the preeminent thought lord you see before you began with a video game as well. My own notoriety stems mainly from a networking framework called Twisted. Some of you may be familiar with this story, but for those of you that aren't, Twisted might sound like a pretty weird name for a networking framework. The name makes a little more sense when you know that it began its life as Twisted.reality, a game engine and development tool used to build an online multiplayer story-driven text-based game called Divinal. Here you can see a screenshot of Divinal running on Linux circa 2003. Twisted Reality went through many iterations, shown here again in its first incarnation shortly after the first release of Mac OS X. Video game code is notoriously complex with respect to the number of possible states in the system, the number of possible concurrent simulations, and concurrent state manipulation code is notoriously tricky to write, especially with threads. So in order to achieve what I wanted to do with Twisted Reality, I had to create Twisted.internet, an event-driven networking layer to coordinate the game simulation. After the first open source release of Twisted Reality, it rapidly became clear that there was a tremendous amount of interest in the networking components. After all, lots of people needed those for lots of different kinds of problems, and almost zero interest in the game engine, which you only needed if you wanted to make the precise kind of game I was trying to make, which is approximately nobody. The rest, as they say, is history. But of course, an exploration of my own previous history is the opposite of my proposed call to zoom out. So I present that example merely by way of an introduction, my own contribution to a pattern that has occurred many times throughout the years. Here you can see Glyph, a little game made by Tiny Speck. You probably haven't played it. It wasn't super popular. Once again, the game part of the game didn't attract broad interest. But in the course of developing the game, Tiny Speck had to create a real-time chat system for collaborating about the game's development, and that had much greater success. Some of you, a couple at least, might have used this system. It's called Slack. Reaching a little further back into history, we find the game never ending, or GNE. The technology used to build this game was then used to build something a little more general and a little more popular, a photo sharing website that some of you might have used. Even today, a tiny number of pages on Flickr.com still have a .gne extension harkening back to the technology which was used to build it. So fine, okay. A couple of popular websites started as multiplayer video games, and I did a weird thing because I love video games and I love talking about them. But websites are by their nature networked and collaborative, interactive things. This might just be a recent blip. Does it really constitute any kind of historical pattern? Well, this is a picture of a video game called Space Travel. It was created in 1969 by a Bell Labs researcher named Ken Thompson. Some of you might have heard of him. Space Travel was originally written for Multics, but after the Multics project was shut down, Thompson still wanted to play it. So he ported it to a PDP-7 they had lying around, which was a crummy old computer that nobody wanted to bother to use on their research projects, even at the time. Quoting from Wikipedia here, by the time Space Travel was fully ported to the PDP-7, Thompson had expanded his software suite to a full basic operating system. That operating system was later named Unix. So I'd say this historical trend of significant software projects starting because we don't have the infrastructure we need to build a fun game, it goes back pretty far. Unix often seems like the dawn of computing history, but history stretches back a little bit further than that. Celebrated computing hero and Nazi defeater Alan Turing wanted to make video games, but first he had to invent the entire idea of a computer. Wikipedia again. The earliest known chess computer program was developed by Alan Turing and David Champernow, called Turochamp, which was completed in 1950, but not actually implemented by them on a computer. Some people periodically take it upon themselves to represent real gamers and try to say anybody who can't click the buttons as fast as they can isn't real. But I think if we're going to have a test to see who a real gamer is, it should be this. Would you invent the entire field of abstract, generalizable computability to invent the idea of a video game so that later somebody else could come along and maybe make a video game? What? No? Okay. Not hardcore then. So almost since the beginning, and this meandering will take us back to the very beginning in a moment, computing has been defined by video games. But what are are video games? And why is it that so many of the foundations of computing seem to have been laid because of them? But Glyph, I hear you say, don't you work at pilot.com? Automated bookkeeping for startups. That doesn't sound very video gamey. Indeed, I do, and thank you for pointing that out, hypothetical audience member. But one of the important things about our product is letting our customers have the peace of mind that their books are done right and letting them enjoy the parts of their business and let them focus on those rather than their financials. And peace of mind is something that even dyed-in-the-wool things that are video games sold on video game stores will try to give you. For example, this game, Mountain, where you, and I quote, fulfill your dream of being a mountain. This is not quite the same as an arcade cabinet experience that you might expect when you say video game. So another way to zoom out is to consider the boundaries of arbitrary categories like video games or computer programs and explore those boundaries to see what we're really trying to do. So to have a suitably broad, zoomed-out definition, I posit that video games have 3 properties. Their software, which is interactive, creates an experience for users, and users enjoy that experience. Further, borrowing from my father here, I suggest that under this definition, this is the only thing that computers are good for. And if you're doing anything else, you should probably stop and try to figure out how it could be a video game instead. But let's break that down. First of all, video games provide an experience. The primary attribute of an experience is that there's an observer. A human is ultimately the consumer of and the purpose for any process performed by an automatic computer. The fact that an experience requires a subjective observer requires us to consider, first and foremost, the subjective impressions that a human might have of our software. Any outputs are going to produce a feeling or at least a thought. In order for a game to be meaningful, there has to be some interactive component. There's a reason that the universally recognized symbol for video games is that of the input device, the controller. Even just as with the experience criterion, this requires us to consider the user, to carefully consider how their inputs will be treated. Are we faithfully honoring the input they're trying to give the game? Is it executing their instructions as they have specified them? And finally, to be a video game, the experience must be enjoyable. After all, why would you make a game if it's not going to be fun? Those of you who've previously used an automatic computer are probably frowning right now. You've probably used a computer program in the past and thought, surely this was designed just to make me angry. This is the definition of tedium. There's no way that I would describe it as enjoyable. Now, in some ways, this is exactly the problem that I'm highlighting. If we're going to be making a thing for people to use, surely it should meet this criterion. Surely software should not be unpleasant. But there's far too much software that falls short of this ideal. But in a sense, this is also a problem of perspective. Let's consider enjoyable in a relative sense. If you're using a computer to do something other than pure enjoyment, you could potentially be doing that thing by hand. For example, let's consider the humble spreadsheets. Spreadsheets are famously tedious. The boringness of spreadsheets is a cliche. I used it as a joke not 30 seconds ago, and you all laughed. But let's zoom out and consider the boundaries of this arbitrary category of spreadsheet. What do you do if you have a bunch of tabular data and you don't have a spreadsheet, or for that matter, a computer at your disposal? When a piece of modern pop culture, here, for example, Agretsuko, a great Japanese TV show about the banality and despair of office life, brought to the US by Netflix, needs to show a stereotype of someone bored at work. They show someone in front of a computer, usually working on a spreadsheet. But that's not the whole picture of the stereotype. What's more tedious than manually filling out a spreadsheet? Bored and tired as Retsuko is here, filling out her spreadsheets, it doesn't compare with her towering rage when surrounded by physical paper that she has to manually add up one piece at a time. Everything you can do in a spreadsheet can be done with physical paper, after all. It's just more tedious. So spreadsheets are, relatively speaking, more enjoyable in tallying numbers by hand. In fact, with the right perspective, spreadsheets are tremendously enjoyable, liberating technology. Those who've had the experience of doing the things that spreadsheets do manually and get to use a spreadsheet to do them automatically definitely appreciate the increased enjoyment of their work. There's a good reason that there's an entire thriving subculture of Excel nerds. This is something that's worthwhile to consider, especially given this specific community's desire to supplant spreadsheets and replace them. Of course, Jupyter Notebooks are an excellent tool, and there are many good reasons not to like spreadsheets. But at the same time, it's important to consider what the appeal of spreadsheets was to begin with and why they're actually kind of great. If someone has a long, tedious task and then a computer makes it faster and easier, that's enjoyable. But the humble spreadsheet has even more going for it than that. Spreadsheet programmers have long done amazing things, from making things much more straightforwardly identifiable as video games, right there in the spreadsheet, to creating stunning works of visual art. This is a spreadsheet. This image, Water Lilies, was created entirely in Excel, and its author, Tetsuo Horiuchi, has created dozens of other similar works in this very unlikely medium. So if software can't fully automate a task, then it can at least allow for a greater degree of creativity and self-expression, as these art projects demonstrate that spreadsheets do. So why did so many creators of software start out trying to make video games? Because they were trying to delight people, trying to make life sparkle just a little bit more. And of course, we got sidetracked, but this is a good thing to remember. As a creator of software, it's useful to remember that we're all in the long haul trying to make stuff more fun. And it might require a 50-year detour through creating an operating system, but all that work eventually does result in software that makes things better. But while the arc of video games does have some important ideas for us and something to aspire to, we should look back even further, back to the origin of the term computer. As many of you probably know, up until around World War II, if you needed a bunch of math done, you hired a bunch of people to do it. Since these people were computing things, they were called computers. This was a manual, menial job. In combination with the fact that most men had to join the army during World War II, most of the computers were women. The women pictured here are computers in the NACA, later NASA, high-speed flight computer room. Some of these computers became the first computer programmers. Once the automatic computer was invented, this opened up a lot more possibilities for the kinds of things you could compute. And of course, at this transition, men ruined everything. This is a picture of ENIAC, one of the first, if not the first, automatic computers. Today, the fastest human computer in the world, the current holder of the Guinness World Record for mental arithmetic, Takahiro Asano, is 1.68 seconds. By contrast, the iPhone X, which many of you have in your pockets, has 346 gigaflops, or 346 billion computations per second. This means that, assuming everyone here was able to work as fast as the fastest person in the world, without breaks for food, water, or sleep, it would take 10,000 people working without breaks a year to do 1 second's worth of your iPhone's work. Rendering a single animation frame from a game of Angry Birds sounds like a pretty crappy way to spend a year, even if it is with 9,999 of your closest friends. There is a reason why computers are such an important part of the video game equation. But while the fun, whimsical story of video games should inspire us to center our users, it's important to confront and understand the darker parts of our collective origin story as well. ENIAC was funded largely by the need for more ballistic ordnance tables than these human computers could produce economically. One of the first uses of the ENIAC after that was to perform calculations to determine the feasibility of a thermonuclear weapon. Creating the nuclear bomb funded ENIAC. Figuring out how to survive an attack from those bombs funded ARPANET, which later became the internet. In many ways, the modern software industry, like the X-Men and Godzilla before us, is a child of the atom. And this industrial ancestor might have important lessons for us too. They had their own collective midlife crisis, and it's one from which they never really recovered. At the start of the nuclear energy industry, scientists, engineers, and the public were all very optimistic about this new technology. JFK called nuclear energy a step on the long road to peace. Science fiction authors from the early 1960s wrote books brimming with stories of palm-sized nuclear reactors, promising infinite, free, safe energy for any application imaginable. Kids wanted to be nuclear engineers because that's where the bright future was. Of course, even at the dawn of the industry, the specter of nuclear weapons and nuclear Armageddon loomed large in public discourse. Nevertheless, thousands of young engineers flocked to disciplines related to atomic power and atomic engineering. Now, unlike a keynote presentation, world history is very long and complex, and many elements that contributed and continue to contribute to a changing public mood around nuclear power continue to unfold today. However, for the purposes of this narrative, let's say that the rocky start of this technology with the atom bomb, and despite a variety of smaller mishaps and injuries along the way to this point, the public attitude towards nuclear power changed abruptly in 1979 when the 3 Mile Island accident released a, quote, unknown amount of radioactive gases over a, quote, large area. Now, depending on your personal view of the cost-benefit ratio of nuclear power, this turning point either allowed for much-needed safeguards to be put in place around a dangerous and out-of-control technology, or it stifled the development of a critical energy source, which could have saved us from the far worse harm that we've since endured from fossil fuels. But when things really went off the rails was 7 years later with the Chernobyl disaster, which rendered large parts of Eastern Europe totally uninhabitable. At that point, globally, the public mood soured from persistent anxiety to reflexive terror. And regardless of your personal feelings about nuclear power, I hope we'd all agree on a couple of things. It would have been better for the public, particularly those directly affected by those disasters, if the nuclear industry had been better about safety before the disasters. And it definitely would have been better for the people in the nuclear energy community themselves, those in industry, science, engineering, and education, if those controls had been put in place by the community itself rather than being imposed by governments reacting to public panic. The atomic energy industry's midlife crisis was a permanent blow to its public persona from which it will never recover. So it might seem like hyperbole to compare it to the relatively sunny space that software currently occupies in the public zeitgeist. And although history will be the judge of which specific event would be that one watershed moment, it seems clear to me that at some point in the last 5 years, we've had a number of troubling developments. Personally, I'm naturally an optimist, but another way to zoom out is to consider the broader landscape of possible consequences of the things that we're doing. The tech hype cycle relentlessly tells us to think everything's going to be great no matter what. In 2014, the infamous heartbleed bug was discovered, which affected millions of systems, exposing a severe economic problem with the way critical infrastructure is developed and maintained. I don't know if we've had our 3 Mile Island or even our Chernobyl yet, but if we keep going at this rate, we'll get there. Let's hit some of the highlights. In 2015, a software bug caused the crash of an Airbus A400M in Spain, killing 4 people. In 2016, the distributed autonomous organization had 30% of its money stolen, in present US dollar value, roughly $1 billion, due to a bug in a smart contract. Since we may have some cryptocurrency fans in the audience, I know New York is a finance town, I'm compelled to point out this is bad regardless of your feelings on cryptocurrency. Either it was bad because it confirms your feelings that cryptocurrencies are a destructive bubble, or it's bad because the response, the fact that they unwound this theft, proved that cryptocurrencies are, in practice, centrally regulated anyway, and therefore the promise of commerce without central authority is basically false. In 2017, Equifax lost all of the personal data of its 148 million customers, effectively the personal data of 50% of the entire population of the United States. The same year, 70,000 devices run by the National Health Service in the UK were compromised, causing ambulances to be diverted, non-critical patients to be turned away, and possibly a few dozen deaths. In 2018, the various abuses of data which Facebook allowed ultimately led to congressional testimony by Mark Zuckerberg and the largest single-day loss of stock market value in history. Everywhere you look, it seems like computer code isn't quite living up to what the public expects of it from the perspective of security, safety, or privacy. One of the questions we need to ask is, can we do better? How can the software industry emerge from its midlife with renewed purpose and vigor and not end up in a situation where careers in software development are seen with the same kind of arm's length, slightly queasy way that you would think of nuclear reactor maintenance in the public imagination? Part of it, I think, is figuring out how to achieve a more sustainable approach to our own infrastructure. Almost all of the examples I just gave you were infrastructure layer issues of some kind. Even the physical airline crash was due to a mistake in the way the plane software was configured and installed, rather than a bug in the code itself. And you might be asking, but Glyph, I don't work on airline hardware. I don't do safety critical systems. This has nothing to do with me. But one of the things I've learned from working in the open source community is that safety critical systems and what we would think of as extremely serious engineering often looks up to the open source community, often looks up to us in trying to understand what the best practices that they should be enshrining. Now, if you're doing safety critical engineering, you have a whole bunch of additional regulations you need to comply with, but ultimately someone needs to figure out what a responsible level of maintenance is. And when your only example is the open source community, that means that we have a responsibility to set a good example and show if you're mandated to do a certain amount of safety and testing checks, if you're building an airliner, we have good practices, which of course, not every open source project can afford the level of investment that an airliner would have to provide to testing, but at least we would show a way to do it that if you invested in it 100 times more, you'd get 100 times better results. So when your little ASCII terminal emoji formatter is on GitHub, just think about that for how well you're going to test it. So how might we go about building that better infrastructure? Well, we might look at a field that has produced somewhat more robust and inspiring projects. Cathedrals, for example, take a very long time to build and are very big and require a lot of people working on them, and they don't fall over as often as software projects. This one, for example, Liverpool Cathedral, was constructed over about 75 years and has not fallen over even once. Software often feels flighty and experimental by comparison to something like this. It takes very little time to build. So we might ask ourselves, what might a piece of software that takes 100 years to build look like? For a long time, I thought this was a very interesting question. But recently, I've begun to realize we all already know the answer to that question. What we don't know is what a piece of software that only takes 100 years to write looks like. This is what a piece of software that takes an eternity to write looks like. Most projects don't even bother to track this, but on Twisted, we have a weekly email dating back almost to the very start of the project when we started tracking bugs, graphing the number of total bugs ever filed against the project versus the number of closed bugs. This particular graph starts in 2003 and goes through 2007. The lines might be a little hard to see, so let me color in the interesting part for you. This is what I like to call the Valley of Despair. This is the number of currently open bugs on the project. You might ask, does this get better over time? And the answer is no. No, it doesn't. Twisted is only special in that we keep track of this. If you graph this for almost any open source project, it looks about the same. And as you can imagine, this is unsustainable. As a small volunteer-based organization, we don't have enough resources to fix all the bugs that everyone wants us to fix, or even properly decide which ones we're going to take on. Of course, we aren't literally stuck with infinite bug counts forever. Eventually, most projects get abandoned, still with thousands of bugs open. Our cathedral goes from construction site to ruin without ever having seen the day where it's open and a finished building. If we're lucky, we set up some pews next to the scaffolding for a while and kind of make do. One of the things that's important to realize about a project that takes 100 years is that if you start one, you're not going to finish it. The people who get to see it completed haven't been born yet. Their parents aren't going to be making cathedral building babies for your benefit. They're going to be residents of the city around the cathedral. The trick to doing a construction project like a huge cathedral that lasts 100 years is not special 100-year construction techniques, although there are a few of those and they do help. It's building a town around where you want to put the cathedral, filling it up with people who want a cathedral and will give you money to build a cathedral and will have the skills to do things you need in cathedral building for more than a generation. If you want to build something big, the first thing that you have to build is a community. We need to build that community, and not just within software, not just at these conferences, not just within Python or within open source, but to build bridges with the general public, with compassion and thoughtfulness and a kind of approach to informed consent where we tell the public what we're doing and why. We don't just randomly A/B test them into oblivion. Quite often when people start saying things like building community or focusing on people, it's an exhortation to stop being just an engineer and instead broaden your horizons to management, where you can make a bigger impact. But I think this stems from a flawed premise. Not that good management isn't important, but management isn't just telling clones of yourself what to do. It's not about scaling up your own decision-making or taking control of larger and larger organizations to do your personal will. And more importantly, if you're just an engineer, you don't get to abdicate your responsibility to be a functioning member of your team, not to mention your profession and your society, just to let your manager handle it. The way that we build community is by communicating with each other as peers. Command and control is a seductive myth because it makes the person on top of the pyramid feel powerful. But even in a big hierarchical project like a cathedral, step one is getting everyone in the town to agree to it, to provide the resources to do it. As programmers, our professional dialogue is important outside of a strict management or professional setting. And this is really the thought that I'd like to leave you all with. You may have noticed that I raised numerous serious problems in the course of this talk, but I didn't provide very clear or thorough solutions. That's because I don't have solutions to the things that I worry about. If I did, I wouldn't be a stereotypical middle-aged guy. And it would be the very height of hubris to think I even might. We can't find our way through the development of a code of ethics, sustainable infrastructure and development practices, of well-designed social impact analysis without coming together and talking these issues through. I told you I was going to talk about you in the topic. And this is really what I love about the Python community. I began this talk by saying that my call to action was to zoom out, take a longer view, look at broader topics, look at other industries. And I think that we could do well to do more of that, especially to push more on the darker side of certain issues in the places where things aren't going super well. But from the Pi Gotham schedule, I can already see the community is deeply invested in this idea. We have multiple talks, including a keynote about ethics on the schedule, Jane Austen, cryptography, operational visibility, incident response, diversity and inclusion, creative musical applications. So in closing, let me revisit the beginning of this talk. There is a critical mistake that people make in their midlife transition, perhaps the worst one that leads to the worst crises. Too much focus on self rather than on family, friends, community, and society. Too much focus on individual pleasure rather than connections. We've got a great community here, and it's important that we appreciate it, and most of all, keep working together within it to address all of these collective challenges that we face. Thank you so much for getting here early and spending your precious attention on my incoherent ramblings, and I very much hope that they will be useful to you. Enjoy the rest of the conference.